one thing that I feel kind of compelled to say after your presentation, Dan, is that, Ed Glaeser, when I first met you, Ed, probably going on 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, he was very active in doing work on this issue of the role of land use policy and its relationship to housing prices and land cost. And it's kind of a rare thing when it comes to the role of the academic as a policy reformer to see within the course of your professional lifetime some significant changes as a result of your work. And I want to give you appropriate credit, Ed. I won't give you all of it. I know you had other colleagues like Joe Jerko and others that you were working with. But the debate on affordable housing 20 years ago in the nation's capital was very much a debate about subsidies or tax credits. If you're a Republican, it was tax credits. If you were a Democrat, it was subsidies. And that when you would go to conferences on affordable housing, what to do about problems of affordability, that was usually where the debates were, and that's where a lot of people focused their energy and time. And I think, on the basis of this work, which really began in earnest 20 years ago and has continued in the work that you and your colleagues do, we really have seen a shift in the policy discussion about this issue of housing prices. It doesn't mean that the reforms are at a point where they're making a huge difference yet, but we are starting to see this convergence of people kind of across the ideological spectrum on this issue, and finally starting to see in some states and some localities some new ideas about what you can actually do to rewrite the rules under which housing can be constructed and how land can be used, which hopefully will have an impact, your desired impact, over time. So it's great to be able to welcome Ed here, who was very involved in those early days. I kind of remember that too. There were these when you were making claims about how much more building was actually possible in New York City, people thought that was crazy. But in fact, there was a lot of opportunity there. For those of you who don't know Ed, he is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he's also the chair of the economics department. And he's won many awards, including most recently being elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Congratulations. He served as an editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics and currently serves as the co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics. And if you love cities as I do, or you're an urbanist and you haven't read his books, you should pick them up. Most recently, Survival of the City, Living and Thriving in an Age of Isolation, and the Triumph of the City, How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Ed. Thanks.
I'm delighted to be the ending for you. I am keenly aware that I'm between you and a beer or whatever it is that you will end, but we'll try and kick some energy into it. I'm going to start with the observation that, in some sense, the ability to be flexible, to be dynamic, to be responsive, is particularly important during a moment of shocks, during a period in which there are outside forces that roil an economy, that roil a society. We are in a moment of sort of unprecedented external shocks to our world, right? Be it pandemic or whatever is going on in the geopolitical context that is enormous. And at the same time, we have hamstrung ourselves by making it more and more difficult to react to things. That is the sort of basic text of my talk, right? This is the point of what I'm trying to make. That in fact, we are in a world in which there's a great deal of outside change, and we have not positioned ourselves in a place where we can respond to that change flexibly. Just some examples of this. For 20 years, Detroit chugged along after World War II, doing reasonably well in its very stagnant, as a fairly stagnant industry. This became much more catastrophic when faced with global competition, when faced with radical increases in gas prices. America's regions have been experiencing shocks, be it the China shock, long before what we've experienced in the past 5 years. And those shocks, played out very differently in different parts of America, partially based on how flexible, how entrepreneurial these areas were. For me, obviously, thinking about cities, the incredible shocks to our largest office markets, some of which were highlighted in Ryan's work, right, is something that is just going to be an enormously difficult thing to respond to. And the nature of our zoning codes, which sort of have created these great islands of skyscrapers dedicated to offices with no interspersing of other functions, make it particularly hard for cities to be flexible, to reshape one another. The need for dynamism is large. The risks of stagnation are severe. Now, I want to take as sort of the patron saint of this talk I want to embrace Manker Olson, right? 40 years ago, Manker Olson wrote The Rise and Decline of Nations, and these are just two quotes from the book. Stable societies with unchanged boundaries tend to accumulate more collusions and organizations for collective action over time, right? Distributional coalitions slow down a society's capacity to adopt new technologies and to reallocate resources in response to changing conditions, and thereby reduce the rate of economic growth. Now, I read this book in graduate school, okay? And it was 1988, and yeah, that sounded a bit like New York City, maybe parts of California, but you know, we had Texas, for goodness sakes, we had Ronald Reagan, we had a lot of things going on in this country that didn't seem like this at all. 40 years later, 35 years later, it feels to me like this is more and more describing in America. That this is not just pre-Thatcher England, that this is the world that surrounds us, a world in which there are rules which constrain whether or not you're going to open a new business or you're going to build a new structure. I want to start by revisiting a little bit of territory that Danny just touched, which is the incredible geographic disparities across America. This is a particular lens on this. This is from a paper of mine from about 4 years ago with Larry Summers and Ben Alston. I think America's largest social problem is the rise of prime-age joblessness. So when I was born in 1967, roughly 1 in 20 prime-age males were jobless. For most of the past 15 years, more than 15% of prime-age males have been jobless. Prime-age, of course, for those of you who don't know, is defined by the census as being aged between 25 and 54. And as I've just told you, my birth year was 1967. You will know how offensive I find that title. But the reason why I think of this as being such a huge problem is that every available piece of evidence we have is that being jobless, particularly for men, is just vastly more catastrophic than being a low-wage worker. Because, a job is not just about your earnings. It's about a sense of purpose. It's about a sense of social connection. Everything that we have, be it misery, be it suicide, be it opioid abuse, shows that sort of joblessness, particularly for men, right, is just catastrophic relative to being a low-wage worker. I differentiate between men and women because when you look at women who are not formally in the labor force, they're actually working. Okay, they're actually taking care of other people in their family. They're doing a lot of other stuff. They're providing a huge amount of value for society. I know you've seen articles on the New York Times website which have this like wonderful house husband who's doing all this great work of taking care of his kids and taking care of like the parents. Based on the American Time Use Survey, which shows basically no increase in caring for others for jobless men, like this is basically one guy that they've managed to find and do stuff like. This is not at all describing the norm for non-employed men in America. And of course, it's very, very not spatially neutral. There's a path of joblessness, right, which runs through America's eastern heartland. This begins down in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up through Appalachia, and ends in the cities of the American Rust Belt, where frequently more than 1 in 4 prime-age men is not employed. Right? This is an absolutely catastrophic situation. It reflects a response to 2 shocks, or a failure to respond to 2 shocks, one of which is the shock of deindustrialization in these areas. In some places, this is also the China shock. But it's also the shock that came from more generous social benefits. Sometimes they're state-level social benefits. Sometimes they are the fact that, these guys have a girlfriend who will bail them out. These guys have parents who will let them sleep on their couches. More than a third of prime-age men are living on their parents in their parents' homes, right? So this is there's sort of this informal social safety net that helps to make this and accompanies the federal stuff. But you have these 2 shocks, they create this massive joblessness, and our country has not been flexible enough to respond. This represents 2 failures of entrepreneurship. One is the failure of entrepreneurship in these places to create ways of employing less skilled guys who are not otherwise working. And the second is the failure to make space for them in the most productive parts of the country. And that's exactly what Danny was talking about. That there are jobs in San Francisco, there are jobs in Los Angeles, there are jobs in Atlanta, right? But they're not moving to them, partially because of the high cost of living. This is my picture of these distributional coalitions. So these are my, understanding, often sympathetic seeming groups that figured out how to organize to block building in America, right? This is the Save the Bay Foundation in Greater San Francisco. One of these is the wife of the Chancellor of Berkeley, Clark Kerr, and these are people arguing to save Penn Station. In lower density America, the language of NIMBYism, of not in my backyardism, is environmental. even when, as Danny told you, this is terrible environmentalism, right? If you actually cared about carbon emissions, you would be boosting for as much building in coastal California as possible because it is such an innately moderate temperature that you just have much lower carbon emissions there. But, they've wrapped themselves around the environment and they've said no to building. By contrast, in an urban core, it's all about historic preservation. And it does not matter how utterly architecturally undistinguished the building is, there will be someone who will argue that it needs to be preserved and that the neighborhood needs to be protected, right? Because this is the ideological cover for fundamentally saying no to change. And it's not obvious to me how much of this is rational. I don't want my prices to go down. I don't want the inconvenience of new people around me, and how much of this is just blind fear of something that's different than what I've currently got, right? And I think both of these things are likely to be going on. One thing that is important, and I didn't have this, and I just want to highlight this, that the places that have managed to shut down building most are the places that actually have highly educated people and that actually would be the best places to build if you wanted to promote upward mobility in this country. So along the x-axis, I've just ranked areas based on the Raj Chetty measure of how well do you do at pulling poor children into middle-income adulthood. Along the y-axis is how restrictive the building code is according to the Wharton Urban Land Use Survey, right? So the highest mobility places are the ones that say no to building the most. Now, Danny talked about this, so I'm not going to say very much, but I want to highlight something a different way in which these land use restrictions make America less dynamic. Most of my work has basically used these kinds of measures, which is along the x-axis you have how much you build, all right, how much new construction there is. Along the y-axis is the gap between how much it costs to buy a house and how much it costs to build a house, right? So a number like 3 means that, in Honolulu, it's 3 times more expensive to buy a house than to build a house. And as you can see, this sort of makes the point that you can't repeal the laws of supply and demand. When you have a highly attractive area and you have a place like Austin that traditionally has made it very easy to build, that shows up in wildly increasing population, as indeed it should, right? And it is a forever slight on blue state Massachusetts that for all of its caring about affordable housing, red state Texas does such a better job of actually providing affordable housing for ordinary Americans than Massachusetts does, right? Along the, but there's also plenty of demand to live in San Francisco and Los Angeles as well. But of course, because it's so difficult to build, that shows up in higher prices rather than extra quantities. But, okay, and this is from a new paper of mine, again, joint with Joe Jerko, Bill Kerr, Leo D'Amico, and Giacomo Ponsetto. Like the building costs, which I have taken as sort of ground truth, and I've taken the gap between these things. So a paper of mine, since Deirdre asked for it, my paper in the JLE from 2005 says that about 50% of the cost of an apartment in New York is regulation. That's the gap between how much it costs to build up and how much it costs to buy. So that's exactly where that number is coming from. But what if the regulation also shaped the physical building costs? What if, in fact, over the long haul, we, in fact, have a building industry that's just far less dynamic, far more, far less productive because we've created these rules? This shows housing units started per employee in the construction sector over the long haul. And what you should be able to see is there's a period from 1940, there's an early period where it's relatively flat in homes per person. There's a growing period, really fairly substantially growing between 1950 and 1970, when our construction sector is just getting much more productive, and then a period from 1970 onward when it's going down. What's happening? Well, let's start in the post-war period. Why is housing getting more productive? The same reason everything gets more productive, because of mass production, right? Because, in fact, the Levitts and other builders were figuring out how to build thousands and thousands of units, typically in one place, right? And figuring out how to reap economies of scale from this. And during this time period, right, the construction sector is changing. It's changing radically. Then in 1970, right, the projects start getting a lot smaller. They start getting a lot smaller because communities get much better at saying no. As the projects get smaller, the companies get smaller. As the companies get smaller, they become less productive, right? They invest less in R&D, and the whole industry stagnates. The paper that, in some sense, we're basing this off of, the first paper to show this is Goolsbee and Syverson, who have a very nice paper showing the decline in productivity in construction. We sort of spend more time explaining why we think that occurs. And we highlight the difference between regulation of entry, which means that you have a few dominant firms, think the big 3 in Detroit in 1950, versus regulation of projects, in which case you, instead of getting a lot of firms, you get very little firms. This is from the Turner and Townsend data that just shows how much more expensive it is to build in the US. This is just the physical cost of building a 20-story projects, 20-story office building. You'll see these are across American cities. There's a big gap between less regulated Houston, where it's just a lot cheaper, and this is just pure physical cost of construction, versus San Francisco and New York that are much more regulated. But of course, we're also much higher than our global comparison cities. Right? So America is just a very expensive place when it comes to building. And this is another way in which we've become less dynamic. We're bad at building structures. We're bad at building infrastructures, right? We're just a very high cost place of doing it. And partially that's about sludge, and partially it's about the fact that we wanted to make sure that nothing goes wrong, and so we're going to cover all these builders with rules, and we're going to cover all the procurement agents with rules, and it's going to make it very difficult for us to find low-cost bids on these things. Okay. This is just making the point about how small the builders are in America. So this is, I think it's just residential builders. So these are the size of single-family builders. Dark blue is 4.56 employees per establishment and up, right? So this is just the average number. So in Texas, there's more than 4.5 people per establishment, but all the places that are dark, that are lighter than that, have less than 4.5 workers on average in the median establishment, right? So they have really, really tiny firms. This shows single-family homes versus almost other industries, right? Most industries are dominated in the 500-plus employee category. Right? Not single-family homes. We're down here. 40% of the firms are 0 to 4 workers. Okay? Another 30% are 5 to 9 workers. These are tiny firms. Why in the world would you expect productivity from mom-and-pop operations that do all of our stuff? This shows you that higher levels of housing regulation are associated with smaller firms, and this shows you the path. Be in mind the y-axis are different. The red axis shows the rise in R&D spending. In manufacturing, the blue shows the parallel decline in R&D spending in construction. So just as manufacturing has become more research, more idea intensive, construction has become less idea intensive, less innovative. Okay, this is my first shock. Now, I wanted my first sort of stagnation. Now I want to shift to the disease side, okay? This pandemic was a shock to us. Of course, cities have been having pandemics for thousands and thousands of years. Our first well-documented urban pandemic is the plague of Athens, which is 430 BCE. And if you think about the backstory behind the plague, right, 5th century Athens is kind of doing all that you could possibly imagine wanting a city to do, right? There's a genius on every street corner. There are amazing things that are happening between Euripides and Aristophanes and Sophocles in drama. There are amazing things with Phidias in sculpture. The two fathers of history, Herodotus and Thucydides, are there. Democracy itself is being born, and on top of it, it's an economic and military powerhouse. Now, all of this success then excites the rivalry of its land-based, non-urban, highly militarily successful rival, Sparta. Sparta demands that Athens stand down from its leadership of the Delian League, and in a speech that would have made, Sam Houston himself proud, Pericles, in his famous funeral oration in the Peloponnesian War, basically says he's not taking guff from anyone, and the Peloponnesian War is on. Now, Pericles, of course, has a cunning plan, which is he's going to summon the Athenians and their Attic allies behind the walls of Athens, trusting to those walls to keep out the superior Spartan army, and then send out the, at that point, vastly superior Athenian fleet to harass the coastline of the Peloponnese. As military strategy, it worked perfectly well. The walls held against the hoplites. But walls that can keep out enemy warriors may not manage to keep out a virus or a bacteria. Cities are vulnerable to pandemic for two particular reasons, one of which they are the nodes on our global lattice of travel and trade. They are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for viruses. And so it was with Piraeus. In 430 BC, something entered and started laying waste to the city. The second vulnerability of cities comes from the fact that people live close to one another, which is often an asset, but it also enables easy travel for bacteria and viruses. Thucydides describes a city that has gone amok, in which people only live for the day because they do not expect to be alive tomorrow. Perhaps 1 in 4 people die from this pandemic. That is a death rate 100 times that of COVID-19, right? Athens soldiers on, right? It takes them another 25 years, 23 years to finally lose the Peloponnesian War, right? There's still some greatness in the city, but in some sense, its luster is dimmed forever. And it merges from being, let's say, the New York City of the Eastern Mediterranean to being the Philadelphia and then, the New Haven. Much of the past 650 years, our cities have been relatively resilient to pandemic. This shows the path of death rates in New York City over the last 200. The early 19th century was a period of proto-globalization, and of course, proto-globalization meant proto-plague. The early decades, you see yellow fever, a mosquito-borne illness that emerges out of Africa, probably in the late 17th century, gets carried along by sail to the Caribbean, and then gets carried up to the cities of the eastern coast. It's killing, 2.5% of the population, so that's 10 times COVID-19 and 1/10 of the death from the plague of Athens. Then, cholera emerges in a particularly virulent form in the Ganges Delta in 1817, gets carried over land by the British Army, gets carried over sea, and then shows up in the ports of North America. There you get death rates that are almost at 5%. Now, despite these death levels, cities continue to grow. Why? Two factors, one of which is they were just really productive. And if your other option is, dying of starvation in Ireland, right, coming to New York and facing the risk of cholera doesn't sound too bad. But there's a second reason, which is that cities and their governments started actually investing in infrastructure that matters. And in our book, In Survival, we tell this as a hinge of history, where this is the point in which governments actually start doing something other than killing people. That, if you think about 18th century and earlier governments in the West, they're pretty much just in the death business. And, as much as we may celebrate, and I know Deirdre celebrates this, right, the eloquent letters that are written between Frederick the Great and Voltaire, let's face it, Frederick the Great's day job was waging war on Maria Theresa and stealing Silesia, right? But all of a sudden, starting in the 19th century, city governments start investing in clean water. They start investing in sewers. They start investing in things which actually save lives. And, I'm a Chicago PhD. I start with a very strong view that, there's lots of stuff that governments shouldn't do, and that's just sort of a basic theme, certainly, of this talk, as it has been through all of these talks. But there are also things that governments should do. And in fact, making sure that guys don't die of cholera is kind of a relatively useful thing for governments to do. These were relatively functional investments. They required, typically, it was a bottom-up thing. You actually had leading citizens come together to create a coalition that did this. And it was bond markets that made it possible for cities to do this, to borrow enough to make these investments. And I think that's another theme of this, that we shouldn't forget that we actually do want our governments to actually make our roads smoother. We do actually want our governments to deal with the education problem in some way, although I'm certainly open to doing vouchers and charter schools. And as a result of these investments, cities got healthier. And for 100 years, between 1919 and 2019, we almost forgot the ability of cities to be killing fields. And then, of course, we suffered another plague. One fact, and this will come back again on the deaths that happen in COVID-19, education is typically protective of cities. The thing that makes Austin so remarkable is its combination of lots and lots of human capital with the relatively pro-business environment of Texas. Right? And those two things just make it a sort of Sunbelt superstar. Education is also protective of health. So you shouldn't be surprised. This is COVID death rates as of the end of last year over the whole time period. And this ranges from about 1/10 of 1% to 4/10 of 1%. The amazing thing is not that there are fewer deaths in more educated metropolitan areas. The amazing thing is the slope. Right? The amazing thing is that you have a fourfold difference between cities like Las Vegas, San Antonio, and Oklahoma, where roughly 4/10 of 1% of the population died, to cities like San Jose and San Francisco, where 1/10 of 1% of the population died. More people died in Seattle of fentanyl overdoses during the COVID pandemic than died of COVID. Now, this reflects also these places had the most extreme work from homes, which may have saved some lives, but they've also created a heck of an economic hangover for these places. And in fact, if you ask what downtowns are you most scared about in terms of coming back, it's surely the sort of San Francisco, Seattles of the world. I'm going to skip over this and come back to it. I don't want to do this now. The shock that cities are dealing with and where their lack of dynamism is causing problems is dealing with the work from home thing, dealing with the fact that this comes from Castle Technologies. It's as of February of this year. This just shows you, these are from key swipes for people entering into large office buildings. This shows you that like you're still at about 50% occupancy relative to pre-pandemic in these fancy downtown offices. Now, for the country as a whole, work from home is a much smaller phenomenon. So if you look at the country as a whole, where about 10% are permanently work from home and maybe 12% are partially work from home, right? The gap with education is enormous, and this was true during the pandemic. In May of 2020, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely, 5% of high school dropouts were working remotely, right? That's an enormous gap. But, you know, this is a big deal. Now, will cities manage to respond to this? Yes, but only if they are flexible enough in order to change. One of the things that sort of shapes my thinking about this is the response to the last massive shock, right? In 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to please turn off the lights. Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. And Seattle had been cutting back on jobs. Of course, Seattle has come back, and I'll tell you my interpretation of why, but I want to set the stage for what was happening, because it's not just Seattle, but it's, you know, all of America's older, colder cities looked like they were headed for the trash heap of history. The big fact that was going on in this is the decline in transportation costs. If you think about America's older cities, every single one of them had their destinies shaped by transportation costs, right? Every one of the 20 largest cities in the US in 1900 was on a major waterway. From the oldest, typically where the river meets the sea, think New York or Boston, to the newest in 1900, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River, right? And these cities formed as nodes on this great transportation network. But over the course of the 20th century, transportation costs plummeted. This is just cost of moving a ton of mile by rail in real cost. That's a 90% reduction. That doesn't take into account, you know, the amazing things that are happening with the highway system, container ships, right? All of these innovations, which meant that like Detroit's location was a huge plus in 1910 when Henry Ford started. By 1960, it was blah, right? It was just a really cold place. And consequently, Americans relocated. Okay, now, there's no variable that better predicts metropolitan area growth in the 20th century than January temperature. Okay, that is a fact. It is an empirical fact that has been shown over and over again. I have certainly written many papers that make this point. There are many things that are rolled up into this, and I can actually answer some of the air conditioning questions, but don't really want to go into it right now because we actually have technologies for determining how much of this is rising amenity values, how much of this is rising productivity, and how much of that is that fact that like these places just make it really easy, warmer places just make it really easy to mass produce housing. All three of these things are going on. And, you know, so part of it is the fact that warmer places are more likely to be right-to-work states. And we know from the work of Tom Holmes, who just looked at counties on different sides of state borders, huge increase in industrial employment after 1947 in right-to-work counties relative to neighboring non-right-to-work counties. This is indeed about, you know, mass production of housing. But let's face it, it's also about the fact that Americans just don't like driving on the ice for 3 months out of the year, as they would in Boston. And I will say, oops, something bad just happened. I will say, as a New England parent who's raised 3 kids amidst all that ice, I think it shows a lack of character on the part of America not to like those icy roads. Now, these are iconic images from my youth, right? This is President Ford during the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, which reflected the fact that on top of the deindustrialization, right? Crime had gone crazy. There had been a complete lack of fiscal responsibility. President Ford, quite understandably, refused to bail out the city, and it really looked as if it was, you know, headed for catastrophe. There you have Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become, again, like a city that looked like it was doomed. But urban density came back. And I think this is really important when we think about dynamism and the reaction to what's going on, right? There are huge problems facing New York and San Francisco, but face-to-face contact is not dead, right? These are two sort of images of what happened in response to deindustrialization, right? In 1980, Alvin Toffler, the hip futurist of his age, wrote a book predicting that all this fancy information technology, think fax machines and personal computers, would make, you know, urban offices just as obsolete as the container ships had made the garment district in New York earlier, right? He looked forward to a world in which we would have empty skyscrapers that we would have to occupy as warehouses and all sorts of stuff like that. Sounds completely familiar to what we've heard in the urban doom literature today. That didn't happen. It happened because instead what happened was we had a large urban renaissance in some, but not all parts of America. And that reflected the fact that large tidal forces in the global economy tended to favor face-to-face contact. Right? What are those forces? A vast rise in returns to skill, a rise in returns to innovation, right? And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people, right? If you don't know that, if you don't know that face-to-face contact is incredibly valuable for learning, then you're not taking advantage of UT Austin properly, right? Because that's what all of our universities are supposed to do. They're supposed to be machines for collaborative learning, machines for collaborative innovation. And of course, globalization did this as well. Right, radically increase the returns to being smart, because if you had a great idea, you could source it or sell it on the other side of the planet. These are just two images of this. This is the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, at Mike Bloomberg City Hall, which is based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, which is based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Trading floors, which of course Jamie Dimon was really eager to bring back during the pandemic, right, are an example of why face-to-face contact is so valuable, right, in a world where information is valuable. Because there is no industry, there is no setting in which it is easier to become rich incredibly quickly by being smart than finance. And so the extra knowledge that you get by being in the midst of the action is just incredibly valuable, and that's not going away. If information technology were making face-to-face contact obsolete, then why in the world would Google, buy the Googleplex? Why would it buy millions and millions of square feet in downtown Manhattan if it didn't think that it was really important to have its young workers right next to each other, right, learning from each other, working together? This, of course, these benefits did not mean that Detroit or, sorry, Danny, Cleveland, necessarily came back, right? Many of the older, colder cities have not come back, never survived, reinvented themselves after the 1970s. What's the secret sauce? Again, if you don't have the kind of pro-business environment and the sunshine that you have in Texas, you at least need to have skills, right? And this shows the relationship between share of the population within BA and earnings. It's not just the fact that your skills make you more productive, it's that your neighbor's skills make you more productive. Above all, Enrico Moretti is associated with this work, but typically the estimates are that as the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10 percentage points, your earnings also go up by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant, right? The advantages of being around other skilled people, and again, since you've lived in highly skilled environments, hopefully all of you have learned something smart from your neighbors, or you figured out some way to get a job from a smart neighbor, or you figured out some way to sell to a smart neighbor, or something like that, right? Having skilled people around you is just really valuable. This shows the growth that's been concentrated, this is after 2000, in highly skilled areas. Again, sort of a real shift towards the more skilled parts of the US, particularly in the north, particularly in the colder parts of America. Now, the skills that matter, and this gets us back to what Ryan was talking, right, are not necessarily the skills that are taught in schools. We tend to focus on those skills because they're measurable. But in some sense, the most important skills are surely those that relate to actually running a business, to actually coming up with new innovations, to actually being functional in the world, which is not something we necessarily teach in our colleges, as we well know. Right? By contrast, I can't think of any skill that is more important than the talent and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 60 years ago, the economist Benjamin Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and noting that New York appeared to be more resilient than Pittsburgh was even then. This was because, in Chinitz's argument, New York had a culture of entrepreneurship that was inculcated by its dominant industry, the garment sector, right? This sector, right, which was the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, significantly larger than automobile production in Detroit, was, unlike automobile production, a mother of entrepreneurship because there were no barriers to entry and very weak scale economies. Consequently, anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. And these entrepreneurs were flexible, right? They would start doing garments, and then they'd start a movie studio, or they'd build skyscrapers, or they'd open a bank, because that's how entrepreneurial human capital works. And it created a place that was flexible when shocked. And that is the fundamental theme of this talk, flexibility when shocked. So even though New York City, right, had a government that was, dumping as much sludge as it possibly could on everyone, right, it had human capital that was maximally adaptive. And that's what enabled it to change. The question is today whether or not that still remains in New York after 50 years. It is remarkable, given how mediocre our measures of things like entrepreneurial human capital are, that they do such a good job of predicting urban growth. This is one of our two measures, which is just the average establishment size in the initial year. The other measure that's typically used is the share of employment in small establishments. Both of them are enormously predictive of which cities manage to have employment growth over the next, so this is 1977 and then over the next 33 years. So as you can see, this is a fourfold difference between the places with the biggest establishments and the places with the smallest establishments. There is a literature And some of the papers are mine, that try to show that this is not just a result of like industry choice or regional choice or other things, and that this is actually seems to reflect a real tendency of places with lots of nimble firms to just add employment more quickly. So my prognosis is that Zoom is not going to mean an end to face-to-face contact, but it certainly does mean a more competitive environment for talent, right? So I want you just to think about like a 15-person startup that's currently in San Jose, right? There aren't, most of them are here now, but like they were there. And just put yourself back in their mindset. I don't think a single one of these guys said, oh, we can now Zoom, let's never meet again. Let's just go to our parents' houses and save housing costs. That's not what they did. They said, oh, we want to go to Austin to not pay state taxes and still be around skilled people. Or, you know, some of them said, we want to go to Vail because we like skiing, or we want to go to Honolulu because we like surfing. The market for talent has never been hotter. And this is in some sense what our local governments face, is an environment in which they need to figure out how to be adaptive and how to get systems that were designed for a totally different world, whether or not those are the physical systems or the regulatory systems, to adapt to this new highly competitive setting. I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to come back to that later. I'm going to go back to my things. Now, which cities managed to do this well? Okay, in the second edition of Survival of the City, we start the book with an attempt to sort of measure which cities did well versus poorly. We take 4 measures which are mainly there because of their relatively high frequency. Changes in earnings and employment, which is coming from the quarterly census of employment wages. Repeat home sales prices. From the FHFA repeat sales index. These years are wrong. I didn't update. We managed to do these up now 2023 now. This is from the original books thing. And we had permit data, so how much new construction is going on. So quantity of permits, prices, quantity of employment, wages. Then we divided these things by the standard deviation of those things across areas, so we created a z-score, and then we just took a simple arithmetic average of those 4 series, which is kind of a stupid thing to do, but you know, it seemed as sensible as anything else in terms of justifying and explaining it. Okay, so what are patterns? Well, January temperature looks really good, okay? It looks even better than it does in those earlier things. This is January temperature and employment change. So this is, you know, kind of what we expect. January temperature predicts quantities. But you could think 2 things are going on with January temperature. One of which is, oh, this is just about people wanting to be in warmer areas because they can be outside and it's safer, and January temperature, higher January temperature places just had fewer lockdown rules and people value that. That's probably true, but that wouldn't predict this relationship, which is the relationship between January temperature and earnings growth. And this is one of the ways we get into whether or not this is the air conditioner or whether or not there's something else going on here. Because if it's the air conditioner, then number of people are supposed to be going up, but wages are supposed to be going down. Okay, because you no longer have to pay people combat pay to put up with the pain of being in a hot place. But the fact that wages are going up is telling you this is not just about wanting to live in warmer places. This is, in fact, about firms wanting to produce in warmer places, right? And so there's a sense in which the warmer parts of America have just proven to be much more dynamic, much more adapted to this in the labor demand side as well as the labor supply side. One fact on housing prices, which is quite striking, typically skills have been very predictive of housing price growth, not over this time period, in fact, the opposite. And in part, what happened is the most skilled parts of America have proven the most able to adapt over space, the skilled workers moving away more. And so it's the places like San Francisco and San Jose and Boston and Washington, which have had really big work from home shifts, in which you've seen the price growth be the most negative. Okay, you can't read that, okay? I can't read that. And but what you got to know is the #1 city on this by a considerable margin is Austin, Texas, okay? Austin is actually on the cover of the book, the hardcover of our book, and you know, that was done with no knowledge of these numbers by our editor, so he deserves kudos for coming up with this. But this was not, you know, this is not because I'm coming here, it's just his Austin 1 on this. And you know, this shows up in incredible housing price growth, probably which will mean revert at some point in time, just because it's relatively easy to build in the region, and that should catch up with you. But you know, change in housing permits way up, relatively robust employment growth. Most of the top 25 is the Sun Belt. So of this top 25, the Sun Belt completely dominates. The bottom 25, you know, there's a lot of sort of Rust Belt in this kind of area, but the real bottom are places that you wouldn't normally think of as being the sort of catastrophes, right? New York is down here. New York, for most of the past 40 years, has been soaring over most of the Rust Belt because its vast office market was an asset rather than a curse. Now it's become a curse, in part because regulations that keep, right, residences out of vast commercial areas, in part because it's segregated its buildings in a way that's really kind of crazy. Washington, D.C., again, for most of the time, government was a stable employer. For the last 3 years, it's been sort of catastrophic. Why? Because I don't know how it is at the Fed, but I'm guessing there's fairly generous work from home policies that are in effect there, and that's true for many government agencies. There's very little competitive pressure in a national government to actually get people to show up. And of course, San Francisco is at the absolute bottom, which is sort of really, really catastrophic. Now, what does this? Again, this is my image of Sunbelt superstars. I'm going to make a couple of observations about what I think this means for local governments and responding to this and being dynamic and being flexible. You really want to think of a world in which talent is mobile, and you want to create an environment in which people want to live. This is the idea of the consumer city, that you want to sort of attract people to vibrant downtowns. And the job of governments, again, it's not to micromanage industrial growth, right? It's to create an area in which, like, smart people want to come and then get out of their way, right? Attract and train smart people and then get out of their way has always been my mantra for urban development. That's not laissez-faire, right? Because in fact, attracting and training smart people requires a relatively sophisticated government that can actually manage city streets, stop crime from getting out of control, and so forth. It does mean that one of the ways that cities become fun are we stop over-regulating urban entrepreneurs. One of the things that shocks me most about this country is the fact that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor so much more tightly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, you can basically have 1 billion users before any regulator knows you exist. If you want to start your food truck 4 blocks away, there are like 18 permits you've got to get through. Okay. In part, this is because, of course, people without fancy degrees from MIT, right, they tend to be entrepreneurs in the real world as opposed to in cyberspace, and this leads to just a very different level of regulatory oversight. Of course, there are things that governments need to do. One of them is safety. One of the sort of particularly unfortunate things, and I see this as sort of a larger problem for cities, is that just at this moment in which cities became more vulnerable because of Zoom, because of the ability to relocate, they decided they were going to fix a whole lot of old social problems. This is exactly the same story that played out in the 1970s, when cities like New York decided they wanted to run a local safety net in which they didn't want to sort of let cops be mean, and consequently crime got out of control, and taxpayers are perfectly mobile, be they individuals or businesses, and they just relocated. And this is something I worry about today. Of course, the particular craziness was, we had, during this time period, a large defund the police movement, or a movement that said, autonomous zones are okay where the police don't do anything. The particular madness about defund the police is that, in fact, what we should have learned from George Floyd is that it is vital that we expect our police to do 2 things. One of those things is actually to make sure that we are safe when we walk the streets at night, right? And remember, that safety is not particularly about wealthy people. The people who are vulnerable when the police fail are the poor. They are young African Americans, right? They're young people who are disadvantaged. And when we do not provide them safety, we're engaging in a horrific act of leaving, it's a civil rights violation, essentially, of leaving them vulnerable, of leaving the most disadvantaged at the most risk of harm. But I share the view of those who want all of our police to treat all of our citizens with respect, right? We're all worthy of dignity. In fact, for any of us who turn libertarian in any way, right, police aren't obviously necessarily, we think, a force for good in all places. And we want to make sure that our police are actually respecting people. Now, if we have a dual mandate for police, right? And I think police are perfectly capable of doing this. I'm very proud of the way the Boston Police Department has evolved over the decades to manage to deliver both of these things, right? Which is certainly not true in the 1980s, where it was a horror show, right? This evolution occurred not by spending less, but by spending more, right? There's no free lunch in government service as there is in anything else. And if you want a dual mandate rather than a single one, and I'm specifically speaking about dual mandates for the Fed representatives here, of both safety and dignity, right? You're going to need to spend more rather than less. And that's just fundamental. You're also going to need to manage better. You're also going to need to measure not just crime levels, but how citizens are reacting to police, and maybe engage in audit studies in which you check how the police are treating people. Last thing I'm going to say, which is about government functioning. And this is from a recent paper of mine, and I'm going to go relatively quickly over it, but it's a paper about road quality. So we've had measures of roads are something that local governments are in charge of. And this is from work, it's called Infrastructure Inequality with Lindsay Currier and Gabriel Kleindler. Road quality is a significant thing in America. Infrastructure is a significant thing in America. It's less sexy than other things we've talked about, but the quality of our infrastructure matters. We've had 40 years of the American Society of Civil Engineers telling us that our highways have been getting worse. Okay, so in the 1980s, they gave us a B minus. That's what that 2.5 or 2.25 says. And it's been down to a D during most of the time period. Over that same time period, or a little bit shorter time period, the Department of Transportation has been sending out trucks at night with accelerometers to measure how bumpy the roads are. You can see what's happened on that side. Our highways have gotten a lot smoother. Okay, over the same time period that the ASCE has been, arguing that we need to spend trillions and trillions of dollars more on infrastructure, our highways have actually not gotten rougher, they've gotten smoother. Now, I'm not saying this to pick on the ASCE, although that's almost irresistible, right, as Deirdre did of all the K Street denizens, and nor am I trying to say that bumpiness isn't a big deal. But the critical element is we need to be smarter about government. And this means, in fact, we need to be smarter about thinking about where we want to invest to get our roads to be smoother. Certainly in my life, my highway drives are smooth. It's when I get off the highway, particularly after months of winter, that like everything's wrong, okay? Everything's bumpy. But the Department of Transportation doesn't measure bumpiness. And in fact, we haven't had widespread measures of it until now. What I have is the universe of Uber drivers from the month of August 2021 and a bunch of data over time in Chicago. I've got all of the cell phone records with the accelerometers data. So all of our cell phones have accelerometers in them. They're what rewrites your cell phone when you sort of turn it around in different ways. All the Uber drivers beam that back to Uber headquarters. They've got a bunch of smart engineers who then can figure out how to tilt out the stuff that's to do with the actual location of the phone and just get you how much the phone is going up or down. There's a bunch of clever stuff we need to go from data that looks like this, and the cleverness is all because of my co-author. My co-authors, not because of me, go from data like this to an actually usable measure, but this is just what a time series looks like of a single drive from downtown Chicago to O'Hare. Bumpy at the beginning, smooth on the highway, bumpy at the end. We can then go from there to measures of local roughness across America. So we can tell you which metropolitan areas are rougher than not. Coasts are generally much rougher than other areas. Houston's terrible, right? Now, the typical story, and I don't have a way of independently measuring this, the typical story for Houston is clay, is the fact that the soil absorbs water and expands. But Houston's almost as bad as New Orleans, which also has the clay problem. The interior parts of America are generally much better than the coasts. But this is our map of the United States. We can then estimate how much American drivers dislike bumpiness. How can we do this? Well, there are two ways of getting a smooth drive, or smoother drive, less bumpiness on your car, one of which is to drive on smoother roads, the second of which is to just slow down. Right? If you slow down, your car vibrates less. And it turns out that drivers do this. So we look at town borders. This is a particularly salient one. This is the Chicago-Evanston town border, right? Which the roads are a lot smoother in Evanston than they are in Chicago. And you can see this. This is the bumpiness shift. This is the speed shift. The drivers speed up when they go to Evanston. And so from there, we can give you a willingness to pay for smoother roads. Now, that's not a total social willingness to pay. That's the driver's dislike of bumpiness. And so there may be positive or negative externalities to others from driving more quickly, right? Probably negative ones. These are our estimates. So this is the baseline cost, dollars per mile, which is about 70 cents. That's the driver's time plus the gas cost. And then this is how much bumpiness adds to it. So at very high levels, it about doubles the cost. At more reasonable levels, it adds about 50% to the cost. We can then correlate this because we were interested in like area median income, area race. If you consider a household that drives about 3,000 miles per year on local roads, on highly local roads, going from 100% white to 100% African-American neighborhood is associated with about $318 extra in road roughness paying for the drivers. Now, that is, if you compare regressions 1, 2, and 3, or regressions, 1, 2, and 3, or regressions 4, 5, and 6, that's almost entirely across town, not within town. Okay, that's about poorer people just living in towns in which they do have rougher roads. A lot of this is not differences in how much they spend on roads, which is an interesting puzzle. It has to do with management of the roads within holding spending constant. This shows you with some big cities and actually tells you why in some of the big cities there's no income gradient with income. So let's just take New York City. We've already seen this map for startups. These areas, the lighter areas, are really like bumpy. So Tribeca, the areas sort of close to Wall Street, these are terrible, terrible roads, right? They also have really, really rich people. And if really, really rich people live near in the urban core, those are also where you get the most trucks coming to, and you end up having the bumpiest areas. In Chicago, you have a slightly different pattern because you still have an industrial area in the west that also has a lot of trucks going on it, that's also really bumpy. And so that has more of a gradient with poverty. You can't see this, but bigger cities have shallower gradients, have much less of an income or race gradient. Small towns and rich towns have more of an income or race gradient. Now, this is my last fact on this, and this is actually the one important fact that I want you to keep away from this. So there's bumpiness across all of America. So maybe you can fit this into a cost-benefit analysis and figure out how much we should be repaving. But it turns out you can make America's roads better in a much simpler way. This shows you the probability of being repaved as a function of roughness at a pre-period. So I've got 8 months of data from 4 cities about what their repaving practices were. And it turns out that in 3 of the 4, there is virtually no correlation between probability of being repaved and the initial roughness, right? We are doing nothing to target in 3 of these cities the rougher roads. And so the simple formula for getting America's local roads to be rougher is just to be smarter about where you repave. Even New York, where there's a slight correlation, right, it's a very, very weak one. Now, what's going on? We did a survey of 120 cities and towns. I'll just show you the US fact over here. Typically, the way that towns do this is they have some measure of documenting roughness. Typically, it's a visual measure that's pretty crappy to begin with. These visual measures end up correlating very little with speed, unlike our measures. Then they have a rule which says all of the roads that fail on this test are supposed to be repaved. Now, what share of cities actually get to them? Percent of roads that, 62% in the US get the road repaving that they're supposed to have, right? So get 30% or less. So 2/3 get less than 3/10. And within that 3/10, there's no targeting, right? So you have a mandate that's unrealistic, and that you're supposed to target all of these places, and then you have, once you fail the mandate, there's no pressure getting you to better roads. In Massachusetts, we're a little bit better, only 30% are there, but once you go to the 30-50%, you're up to 74% do 50% or less of the roads that they're supposed to. This is my final point on this, that dynamism in America requires 2 things, right? It requires governments to do a whole lot less of unwise regulation, whether or not that's regulation of small businesses or building or, large businesses, large, more dynamic areas. But it also does require our governments to be better, and even more, it requires us citizens to ask that our governments do more. I've shown you a really simple way in which I think our governments are doing poorly, which is they're doing a poor job of targeting road repaving. It's simple, it's obvious, right? But we're trying to do another large push on figuring out why it is that our roads cost so much. And again, I think Cass has a lot to do with it, which is we cared a lot about eliminating all forms of corruption in road contracts. We didn't care at all about reducing prices. And so constantly we put in a whole bunch of sludge that made it impossible to get more competitive bidding, easier entry of firms into this process. But there are even higher things that we think we need to get better on, right? Policing needs to get better. We need to make sure that we keep our city streets safe, or all of our streets safe. At the same time, we treat everyone with respect. We need to lock up fewer people for minor crimes and still manage to preserve safety on our streets. And then at the highest level, there is fundamentally the schooling problem, right? We need to make sure America continues to have the level of opportunity that we want it to have. Our traditional engine of that has been education. I am open for lots of other engines. I'm not saying that needs to be the engine or the traditional public schooling needs to be that. But skills are the bedrock on which individual, place, city, or national success rests. Right? And we're not going to be strong as a nation unless we are leading the world in our skill levels. And fundamentally, our government has taken on responsibility for this. So that also needs to be something that's on the agenda. But I am in Texas, and it is impossible not to be confident in Texas and not to have a certain amount of optimism. So despite the challenges that we face, let's not count this country out yet. Right? There's a lot of possibility for dynamism yet in it, but we need to take on the hard work of actually tearing down the regulations that make us weak and improving the quality of public services that will help our natural strengths. And so thank you very, very much.
And I was wondering about the percentage of paved roads that you were showing for was it Massachusetts?
Those are 4 cities: Dallas, which are they? Dallas, New York.
Basically, I think it was the amount of roads that still needed to be fixed or maintained because they were too rough.
This one?
No, the following. I think it was the following one. This one, yes.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, spending on resurfacing versus preventative maintenance, excuse me. I'm wondering if you're accounting for the differences in jurisdictional ownership in these roads. Because, for example, some of these roads here are maintained by the city of Austin, but then, for example, when you're looking at the frontage roads over here by I-35, that's really TxDOT's pot of money. So was that jurisdictional difference accounted for here?
So remember, this is a survey that's administered to a local Department of Transportation. So I can go back and look at the question, but it would be pretty odd to say, oh, we're failing to resurface a bunch of roads because it's not a responsibility. Because it's now, I need to check on that, but you're right, of course. Lots of roads that are in local places are not local responsibility, but it would seem, the way that the survey was phrased, it was supposed to be about the roads that you're responsible for, not the roads that somebody else is responsible for.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. There's a joke in Cheers where Woody asks Fraser Crane about, you're a Rhodes Scholar, are you? So tell me about why we have so many potholes, right? Playing on the roads. We actually had a research assistant who worked on this paper who actually did get a Rhodes Scholarship. So he is actually a Rhodes Scholar who actually does know about potholes.
Amazing. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could, you ended the talk by stating that dynamism in America requires us that we ask more of our government to do more roads, police, education. Can you explain a little bit more how those sorts of asks might lead to more dynamism?
So the school side should be obvious. The safety side, I think, is also fairly clear. Lots of young lives get corralled because, people screw up and get involved in either, they become criminals or they get locked up because they haven't been distracted, been pushed away from that earlier on, right? We want a public safety system that sort of basically does enough deterrence so you don't think that entering, you're not willing to take the risk that you might end up in jail. So you want a thing that sort of stops them off at the beginning. And that's another thing that we're asking of our safety, is that we want to make sure we don't have the lost Einsteins, make sure we don't have the lost talent on this. In terms of the road stuff, I think the larger, American infrastructure is not actually what's holding us back. It is uncomfortable and it is something that pushes people around. But unlike, let's say, the developing world, where there are many parts in which you just can't imagine doing manufacturing there because the roads are so bad, that's not fundamentally what's holding America back. What is, however, holding us back is the fact that since we have gotten bad at these things, right, we can't actually imagine a slightly different world, right? We can't imagine a world in which we have innovation in transportation that matches the innovation that we have in software, or matches the innovation that we have in other areas. And in some sense, this clunky, mid-20th century system doesn't allow improvements in these parts of our lives, which also matter. So I'll just give you an example of that, which is, right, we have a huge amount of debate that's going on around high-speed rail in California, right? High-speed rail is an odd attempt to use what's fundamentally a 19th century technology and somehow or other spend tens and tens of billions of dollars on it in the 21st century, in a way that, of course, it was sold, it was vastly oversold to California voters as a typical, underestimate of cost that's just massive, right? Why aren't we imagining different things, like putting autonomous buses on dedicated intercity lanes going at 150 miles an hour? Why isn't that a perfectly reasonable alternative that is just far more flexible, far more affordable? And we should have the level of sort of innovation and flexibility in this sector, albeit as it does connect with the public sector, as we do in other areas. And in that sense, I think the transportation stuff is making us less dynamic than it should be. So thank you for your question. Thank you for both of your questions.
Yeah, just a quick question about Salt Lake City that I noticed on some of your slides earlier. It doesn't correlate with the warmer January for sure, but it seems to have done very, very well. It was earlier slides than this. And I was just curious if you had a comment on that, because it seemed like an outlier.
So there are a bunch of nice places in the West which don't need to be that warm. So it's not that, so you got, whereas Salt Lake is high up here, and it does unusually well. I think Denver is also in the top 5, and I think it is sort of being in the same kind of West Coast areas that are sort of pleasant, but not, not coastal California difficult. But it's, I think it's also true that in some sense Salt Lake City's human capital is very special, and it's relatively good at creating a relatively livable environment, particularly for families with kids. So I think there's a lot that's going on there in terms of high amenities, even though it's not quite as warm as other parts of the world. So I think that's my sort of armchair theorizing about why Salt Lake City is doing well. But it's also pretty nice around there. I mean, albeit the colder winters. But we can have a whole Salt Lake City-based research agenda going forward.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I may have missed the point about the office buildings. On the one hand, you thought, we think that return to face-to-face is still really important. On the other hand, it's kind of a challenge right now with, some of these major centers not really having a full return to in-person work. So, just speculating, where do you think that's going? Should cities work to have those transition to residential or some other use, or eventually everyone will be back in person?
Our Econ 101 answer is you got the structures there. They started off at fairly high prices prior to COVID. What should happen is the prices should fall and they should get reoccupied. That's our Econ 101 answer. Now, for whatever reason, it's taking an enormous amount of time for that to happen. And that sort of relatively sanguine view is troubled by the fact that, we had a sort of retail apocalypse on the ground floor of many of our older cities, which has taken, at least a decade. We've had ground floor vacancies. And it's clear that there are a bunch of things that go on in terms of the real estate markets that just make them really clunky in lots of ways. One of the things that make it clunky are clauses that are built into real estate-based loans that mean you cannot cut the nominal rent. That's meant to end sweetheart deals at the end of various things. I'm sort of optimistic that they will eventually refill. Some of them will repurpose, but the costs of reconfiguring office for residents are huge, right? So that's going to be a relatively limited high-end thing. With this relatively upbeat view, even though it may take another 5 years, there's still going to be cities for whom, so New York drops by 30% in commercial rents. San Francisco drops by 40% commercial rents, right? They're still going to exist. They're still going to be occupied. Buffalo drops by 30% in office rents. Cleveland drops by 30% by office rents. There are going to be people walking away from those buildings, right? And so you have the possibility for sort of significant vacancies that then sort of ripples through the sort of urban doom look kind of thing. But, and I think I want to end on this, but the point that I made about sort of making it difficult to react is really shown, I think, pretty well in land use regulations, right? So one of the things, some cities have been relatively good in terms of rezoning, making it possible to rebuild, but in some sense, it's all too late because once you've built the structures, it's very hard to adjust. And the larger lesson going forward is that these rules hamper you over time. Right? They make it very difficult to build, to build a kind of city that will be flexible. A city that has sort of large areas that are zoned for one and only one thing is maximally inflexible, right? And that didn't happen by accident, that happened because of government rules. I go back and forth in terms of which elements of land use controls I hate most on a given day. So I wake up in the morning, I say, do I hate the parking requirements most, right? Which seem particularly crazy in an era in which people are worried about climate change. Do I hate maximum floor area ratios or minimum acreage signs more? Yeah, there's sometimes that I hate that more. Do I hate more single-use zoning, so-called Euclidean zoning, that makes it very difficult to have interspersed areas, which just seems so much more healthier, particularly now than they did before. Sometimes I hate those most. But the answer is we just should never have let this go crazy, right? The federal government played a role in this. There was a whole mission that Herbert Hoover was on in the 1920s from the Department of Commerce to push zoning on local communities who lapped it up. And over time, we've created a straitjacket that it's made it very, very difficult to deliver affordable housing for ordinary Americans and made it very difficult to move to more productive areas and made it very difficult for cities to change. And this is a great place to take up the charge for dynamism. In Texas's case, I think the goal is just to stop Texas from turning into California. The starting point for Texas is relatively good on land use controls, but there's always a risk, and it sort of is an important one. But there are other areas as well in which we, let's do battle against occupational licensing. it's not just national occupational licensing, it's state-specific occupational licensing, which means that, it's not just that we have a rule that we need someone to make sure that you don't put on the wrong green wallpaper. It's like you can't have the person that whatever it is that Tennessee says you need to know to not put on the green wallpaper. Like, that's not relevant in Kentucky, so you need to follow a different rule. I can't think of anything that looks more like the Olson vision of insiders blocking out outsiders. And so I think the fight of Civitas, the fight for freedom, the fight for dynamism, the fight for an America that can respond to shocks has never been more vital, and I thank you very much for your time.